We'll define listening, at least in the interpersonal type, as the process of making sense of others' messages. Hearing is the process in which sound waves strike the eardrum and cause vibrations that are transmitted to the brain. Listening occurs when the brain reconstructs these electromechanical impulses into a representation of the original sound and then gives them meaning. Mindless listening occurs when we react to the other's message automatically and routinely without much mental investment. Words such as superficial or cursory describe mindless listening better than terms like ponder or contemplate. In contrast, mindful listening involves giving careful and thoughtful attention and responses to the message we receive. You tend to listen mindfully when a message is important to you and also when someone you care about is speaking about a matter that is important to him or her. The elements in the listening process are hearing, attending, understanding, responding, and remembering. Hearing is the physiological dimension of listening. Again, it occurs when the sound waves strike the ear at a certain frequency and loudness. So hearing is influenced by a variety of factors, including background noise. If there are loud noises, especially at the same frequency, it becomes much more difficult to hear that message. Whereas hearing is the physiological process, attending is a psychological one, and is in part of the process of selection. Whereas hearing is the physiological process, attending is a psychological one and is part of the process of selection in the perception process. It is not surprising that research shows that we attend most carefully to messages where there is a payoff for us doing so. Understanding occurs when we make sense of a message. It's possible to hear and attend a message without understanding it at all. Communication researchers use the term listening fidelity to describe the degree of congruence between what a listener understands and what the message sender was attempting to communicate. Responding to a message consists of giving observable feedback to the speaker, and now that feedback can be both verbal and nonverbal. Remembering is the ability to recall information. Research suggests that people remember only 50% of what they hear immediately after hearing it. Within 8 hours, that 50% remember drops to about 35%. After 2 months, the average recall is only about 25% of the original message. So given the amount of information we process every day from our teachers, friends, the radio, TV, the residual message, that is, what we remember, is only a small fraction of what we hear. Pseudo-listening is the imitation of a real thing. It's an act to put on to fool the speaker. Pseudo-listeners give the appearance of being attentive, so they look at you in the eye, they may nod and smile, but the show of attention is to a polite facade because their mind is somewhere else. Stage hogs try to turn the topic of conversation to themselves instead of showing interest in the speaker. One stage hogging strategy is a shift response, changing the focus of the conversation from the speaker to the narcissist. You think your math class is tough? You ought to try my physics class. Interruptions are another hallmark of stage hogging. Besides preventing the listener from learning potentially valuable information, they can damage the relationship between the interrupter and the speaker. Selective listeners respond to only parts of your remarks that interest them, and rejecting everything else. Insulated listeners are almost the opposite of their selective cousins just described. So instead of looking for specific information, these people avoid it. So whenever a topic arises that they'd rather not deal with, those who use insulated listening simply fail to hear or acknowledge it. Defensive listeners take others' remarks as personal attacks. Ambushers listen carefully to you, but only because they're collecting information that they'll use to attack what you say. Those who use insensitive listening respond to the superficial content in a message, but miss the more important emotional information that may not be expressed directly. How's it going? An insensitive listener might ask, when you reply by saying, "Oh, okay, I guess," in a dejected tone. He or she responds, "Well, great." Why we don't listen better. Message overload. It is especially difficult to focus on messages, even important ones, when you are bombarded by information. Face-to-face messages come from friends, family, work, and school. Personal media, text messages, phone calls, emails, instant messages demand attention. So this large amount of communication has made the challenge of attending tougher than at any time in human history. Preoccupation is another reason why we don't always listen carefully, and that's when we are often wrapped up in our personal concerns that seem more important than the messages that others are sending. It's difficult to pay attention to someone else when you're worrying about an upcoming exam or thinking about a great time you plan to have over the next weekend. Rapid thought. Although we're capable of understanding speech rates at 600 words per minute, the average person only speaks between 100 and 150 words a minute. So therefore we have this mental spare time while someone's talking. The temptation is to use this time in ways that don't relate to the speaker's ideas, thinking about personal interests, daydreaming, planning a rebuttal, and so on. We often make faulty assumptions that lead us to believe we're listening attentively when quite the opposite is true. When the subject is a familiar one, it's easy to tune out because you think you've heard it all before. A related problem arises when you assume that the speaker's thoughts are too simple or too obvious to deserve careful attention, when in fact they do. At other times, just the opposite is true. You think that another's comments are too complex to be understood, as in some lectures, so you give up trying to make sense of them. Prompting involves the use of silences and brief statements of encouragement to draw others out. Besides helping you better understand the speaker, prompting can also help others clarify their thoughts and feelings. Questioning has been called the most popular piece of language. Asking for information can help both the person doing the asking and the one providing answers. Questioning can also help you, the asker, in at least 3 ways. Most obviously, the answers you get can fill in facts and details that will sharpen your understanding. Also, by asking questions, you can learn what others are thinking and feeling, as well as what they might want. Despite the apparent benefits, not all questions are equally helpful, whereas sincere questions are aimed at understanding others. Counterfeit questions are aimed at sending a message, not receiving one. So counterfeit questions come in several varieties, such as questions that trap the speaker, tag questions, questions that make statements, questions that carry hidden agendas, questions that seek correct answers, and questions based on unchecked assumptions. Supporting responses can be helpful. Guidelines for effective support include: recognize that you don't have to approve to support. 2. Monitor the other person's reaction to your support. 3. Realize that support may not always be welcome. 4. Make sure you're ready for the consequences. When analyzing, the listener offers an interpretation of a speaker's message. There are several guidelines for effective analyzing. 1. Offer tentative interpretations. Be sure the other person will be receptive to the analysis. And 3. Be sure the motive for your analysis is truly to help. When we are approached with another person's problem, a common tendency is to respond with advising, that is, to help by offering solutions. Research has shown that this is actually unhelpful, at least as often as it is helpful. Here are some guidelines for effective advice. Is the advice needed and wanted? Is the advice given in the right sequence? Is the advice coming from an expert? Is the advisor a close and trusted person? Is the advice offered in a sensitive manner? A judging response evaluates the speaker's thoughts or behaviors in some way. So the judgment may be favorable, like, that's a good idea, or you're on the right track. In other cases, negative judgments are less critical. These involve what usually called constructive criticism, which is intended to help the problem holder improve the future. Judgments have the best chance of being received when 2 conditions exist. 1, the person with the problem has requested an evaluation from you. And 2, the intent of your judgment is genuinely constructive and not designed as a put-down. When choosing the most appropriate listening response, things you need to consider are gender, the situation, the other person, and your personal style.